The old concert hall stood quiet on that Tuesday afternoon. Dust particles danced in the sunlight streaming through tall windows. Inside the practice room, a famous pianist named Richard Carmichael sat at his grand piano, running through scales with mechanical precision. He had been teaching music for 30 years, and his reputation was both respected and feared. Students whispered about his harsh critiques and impossible standards. Outside in the hallway, a young boy named Marcus waited with his mother, Sarah. Marcus was only 8 years old, with a bright smile that never seemed to fade despite the challenges life had thrown at him. He was born completely blind, but his world was filled with sounds that most people never noticed. He could hear the hum of fluorescent lights, the rhythm of footsteps, and most importantly, the beautiful melodies that seemed to float through the air whenever someone played music. Sarah looked down at her son, her heart heavy with worry. They had visited 4 music teachers already, and each one had turned them away. Some were polite about it, making excuses about full schedules. Others were more direct, saying they didn't have experience teaching blind students. But Sarah knew her son had something special. At home, Marcus would sit at their old keyboard for hours, picking out melodies he heard on the radio or creating his own songs. His fingers moved across the keys as if they had eyes of their own. The door to the practice room opened, and a stern-looking man appeared. Richard Carmichael was tall and thin, with gray hair combed perfectly to the side. His eyes were cold and assessing as he looked at Sarah and then down at Marcus. He didn't smile or offer a warm greeting. Instead, he simply said they could come in for the evaluation. Marcus held his mother's hand as they entered the room. The space smelled of old wood and polish. Marcus could hear the echo of their footsteps on the hardwood floor. But what captured his attention immediately was the grand piano, sitting in the center of the room. Even without seeing it, Marcus could sense its presence, its promise of music waiting to be released. Richard gestured toward a chair for Sarah, and then addressed Marcus directly. His voice was flat and professional as he asked basic questions about the boy's musical experience. Marcus answered each question with enthusiasm, his face lighting up whenever he talked about music. He explained how he loved listening to classical composers, how he tried to recreate their pieces on his keyboard at home, and how music made him feel like he could see colors and shapes. The pianist listened without expression. When Marcus finished talking, Richard walked over to the grand piano and sat down. He played a simple melody, just 8 notes in sequence. Then he turned to Marcus and asked him to repeat it. Sarah held her breath. This was the moment that had defeated them at other studios. Teachers would test Marcus and then gently explain that learning piano required visual instruction, reading sheet music and watching hand positions. Marcus approached the piano carefully, using his hands to feel the edge of the bench before sitting down. He placed his small hands on the keys, took a breath, and then played the 8 notes perfectly. The sound was clear and precise. Richard's eyebrows raised slightly, but he said nothing. He played a more complex sequence, 16 notes with varying rhythms. Again, Marcus repeated it flawlessly. For the next 20 minutes, Richard continued to test the boy. Each melody became more complicated, with intricate patterns and unexpected key changes. Marcus never hesitated. His fingers found the right keys every time, and more than that, he played with feeling. When the melody was sad, his touch was gentle. When it was joyful, his playing became more energetic. Finally, Richard stopped. He sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the piano keys. Sarah couldn't read his expression. Was he impressed, annoyed? She squeezed her hands together nervously, preparing herself for another rejection. Richard turned to face them both. His voice was cold and matter-of-fact when he spoke. He told Sarah that while Marcus clearly had an excellent ear for music, that wasn't enough to become a real pianist. Piano, he explained, was an instrument that required sight. Students needed to read complex musical scores, watch their hand positions, coordinate their movements visually, and learn from observing their teacher's demonstrations. Marcus's smile faded as he listened to the words. He had heard similar things before, but something about this man's tone made it hurt more. Richard continued, saying that he had trained dozens of professional pianists over his career, and he knew what it took to succeed. Without vision, Marcus would always be limited. He might learn to play simple songs by ear, but he would never achieve true mastery. He would never perform in real concerts or understand the deeper complexities of classical music. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She started to stand, ready to take her son's hand and leave with whatever dignity they had left. But before she could move, Richard said something that made the air in the room feel heavier. He looked directly at Marcus and said the words that would echo in that room for years to come. He told the young blind boy that he should accept reality and find a different path in life. Music could be a hobby, something to enjoy, but Marcus should understand that he would never be able to truly play piano at a professional level. The limitations were simply too great. The room fell silent. Sarah's heart broke as she watched her son's shoulders slump. Marcus's hands, which had been so confident on the piano keys moments before, now hung limply at his sides. The joy that usually radiated from him seemed to dim, but then something unexpected happened. Marcus lifted his head. Even though he couldn't see the pianist, he turned his face toward where the man sat. His voice was quiet but steady when he spoke. He told Richard that he understood what he was saying, but he had one request. Could he play one more thing before they left? Just one song that he had been working on at home? Richard seemed surprised by the request. He checked his watch with obvious impatience. His next student would arrive soon, and he had already made his assessment clear. But something about the boy's quiet dignity made him pause. After a moment he sighed and gave a curt nod, gesturing toward the piano. Marcus stood and walked back to the grand piano. He sat down on the bench and took a deep breath. His mother watched from her chair, pride and sadness mixing in her chest. She had no idea what her son was about to play, but she knew it would be special. Marcus always poured his heart into his music. The boy placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The first notes that came from the grand piano were soft and tentative, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Marcus's small fingers moved across the keys with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a child his age. He was playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece known for its emotional depth and technical difficulty. It was a composition that even experienced pianists approached with respect. Richard Carmichael's expression changed immediately. His eyes widened and he leaned forward in his chair. This was not the simple melody of a child who had learned a few songs by ear. This was real playing with proper technique, dynamics, and most remarkably, genuine emotional interpretation. The boy's hands moved with confidence, his fingers curving naturally as they should. His wrists positioned correctly despite never having seen a proper demonstration. Sarah watched her son with tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. She had heard Marcus practice this piece at home on their old electronic keyboard, but hearing it on this magnificent grand piano was entirely different. The rich tones filled the room, each note resonating with clarity and purpose. The melody seemed to paint pictures in the air, telling a story without words. Marcus played as if he had forgotten anyone else was in the room. His face showed complete concentration but also peace. This was where he belonged, at a piano, creating beauty with his hands. When the piece required softer touches, his fingers barely kissed the keys. When it called for power, his whole body engaged with the music, his shoulders moving, his head swaying slightly with the rhythm. The technical aspects of his playing were impressive enough, but what truly shocked Richard was the interpretation. Marcus understood the emotion behind each phrase. He knew exactly when to slow down for dramatic effect, when to build intensity, and when to let the music breathe. These were instincts that usually took years to develop, yet this 8-year-old blind boy possessed them naturally. As the piece continued, Richard found himself forgetting to breathe. In his 30 years of teaching, he had encountered talented students, certainly. He had trained pianists who went on to successful careers, who performed in prestigious venues and won competitions. But natural talent of this magnitude was extraordinarily rare. He had only witnessed it perhaps twice before in his entire career, and never in someone so young. The middle section of the Nocturne arrived, where the melody becomes more complex, with rapid notes cascading like water over rocks. Marcus's fingers flew across the keys with precision. There were no mistakes, no hesitations. Every note was exactly where it should be, played with the correct timing and emphasis. His muscle memory was perfect, but more than that, he seemed to feel the music from somewhere deep inside himself. Sarah noticed that other people had gathered outside the practice room door. Students and teachers who had been passing in the hallway had stopped when they heard the music. They stood quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening inside, but unable to walk away from the beautiful sound. Some of them had studied piano for years and recognized the difficulty of what they were hearing. Others simply knew they were experiencing something special. Richard sat completely still, his earlier coldness melting away with each passing measure. He began to see his own prejudice clearly for the first time. He had looked at Marcus and seen only limitations, only obstacles. He had allowed his rigid ideas about how piano should be taught to blind him to the obvious truth. This boy didn't just have an ear for music. He had a gift, a genuine, extraordinary gift that transcended the usual requirements of musical training. The piece moved toward its conclusion, the melody returning to the gentle, contemplative mood of the opening. Marcus's playing became even more tender, each note delivered with exquisite care. His hands moved with the sureness of someone who had spent a lifetime at the piano, yet he was still just a child, his legs barely reaching the floor as he sat on the bench. When the final note sounded and slowly faded into silence, nobody moved. The room seemed to hold on to that last tone, unwilling to let it go. Marcus kept his hands on the keys for a moment longer, his head bowed as if in prayer or gratitude. Then he lifted his hands and folded them in his lap, turning his face toward where he remembered the teacher sitting. Richard realized his hands were shaking. He looked down at them in surprise. In all his years of teaching and playing, he couldn't remember the last time music had affected him so deeply. He felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he had built over decades of rigorous standards and harsh judgments. This blind child had just shown him what real music was about. It wasn't about reading notes on a page or perfect hand positioning, or any of the technical things he had spent his career emphasizing. It was about connection, feeling, and the mysterious ability to translate emotion into sound. Sarah wiped her eyes and waited for the teacher to speak. She could see that something had changed in his demeanor, but she was afraid to hope. They had been disappointed so many times before. She reached out and gently touched Marcus's shoulder, letting him know she was there, that she was proud of him regardless of what happened next. The silence stretched on. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was different from before. The coldness was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like awe. He asked Marcus where he had learned to play like that. Who had been teaching him? Marcus turned his face toward his mother and she answered for him. She explained that no one had taught him formally. They had an old keyboard at home that her mother had left them. Marcus had started pressing keys when he was 3 years old, finding notes that sounded good together. As he got older, he would listen to recordings and teach himself to recreate what he heard. She had tried to find him proper instruction, but every teacher had said it wasn't possible without sight. Richard stood up from his chair and walked slowly to the piano. He looked down at the keys, then at Marcus, then back at the keys. His mind was racing with possibilities, but also with doubts about himself. Could he teach this child? Did he have the flexibility to adapt his methods? More importantly, did he deserve the privilege of guiding such extraordinary talent? He asked Marcus another question. He wanted to know why the boy loved piano so much. What made him practice for hours without a teacher, without encouragement, without even a proper instrument? Marcus's face brightened immediately. His answer came without hesitation. He said that when he played piano, he could see. Not with his eyes, but with something deeper. The music created shapes and colors in his mind. Happy songs were bright yellow and warm orange. Sad songs were deep blue and soft purple. When he played, he wasn't blind anymore. He could see entire worlds that existed only in the sounds he created. Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had been playing and teaching piano for most of his life, but somewhere along the way he had forgotten this essential truth. Music wasn't about perfection or technical mastery. It was about vision, about seeing and sharing things that couldn't be expressed any other way. This blind child understood that better than he did. The people outside the door were still standing there, waiting to hear what would happen next. Some of them knew Richard's reputation. They knew he rarely accepted new students. And when he did, he chose only those he believed had potential for serious careers. They wondered what he would say to this boy. Richard Carmichael did something he hadn't done in years. He got down on one knee beside the piano bench, bringing himself to eye level with Marcus. Even though the boy couldn't see him, Richard felt it was important to meet him this way, with humility rather than the authority he usually maintained with students. His voice was quiet when he spoke, and Sarah had to lean forward to hear him. Richard told Marcus that he had been wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. He had let his own limited thinking blind him to something remarkable. He admitted that in all his years of teaching he had never heard anyone play with such natural musicality. The boy had a gift that couldn't be taught, a connection to music that most pianists spent their entire lives trying to achieve. Marcus tilted his head, listening carefully to the teacher's words. He could hear something different in the man's voice now. The coldness was gone, replaced by warmth and sincerity. Sarah's heart began to race. Could this finally be the moment they had been hoping for? Richard continued speaking. He said that if Marcus was willing, he would be honored to become his teacher. But he was honest about the challenges ahead. He had never taught a blind student before. His methods would need to change completely. There would be no sheet music to read, no visual demonstrations to follow. They would have to create their own way of learning, discovering what worked through trial and error. He paused and then added something that surprised even himself. He said he suspected that Marcus wouldn't just be his student. The boy would also be his teacher, showing him new ways to understand and share music. Richard realized that this opportunity was as valuable for him as it would be for Marcus. Marcus's face broke into the brightest smile. He asked if Richard was serious, if he really meant it. The famous teacher, the man who had just minutes ago said he would never truly play piano, was now offering to teach him. It seemed too good to be true. Richard placed his hand gently on Marcus's shoulder. He promised he was serious. He suggested they start with 2 lessons per week, and he wouldn't charge any fee until he was certain he could actually help Marcus progress. This was going to be a learning experience for both of them. Sarah couldn't hold back anymore. She stood up quickly and covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. She had fought so hard for this moment, visiting teacher after teacher, refusing to give up on her son's dream. And now, finally, someone saw what she had always seen. Someone recognized that Marcus's blindness wasn't a limitation on his musical ability. It was simply a different way of experiencing and creating music. The news of what had happened in that practice room spread through the music school like wildfire. By the time Richard opened the door, a small crowd had gathered in the hallway. Students and teachers alike wanted to know about the blind boy who had played Chopin's Nocturne so beautifully. Some were skeptical, assuming the story had been exaggerated. Others were curious about how Richard would adapt his notoriously strict teaching methods. Over the next few weeks, Richard discovered that teaching Marcus required him to completely reimagine his approach. Instead of pointing to sheet music and showing finger positions, he had to describe everything verbally. He would play a phrase and then talk about how his hands moved, what each finger was doing, how much pressure to apply. Marcus absorbed everything like a sponge, his memory astonishing in its precision. They developed a system using tactile markers on the piano keys so Marcus could orient himself quickly. Richard recorded himself playing pieces slowly, explaining each section in detail so Marcus could listen at home and practice. But most importantly, Richard learned to trust Marcus's own instincts. The boy often found fingering solutions that were different from traditional methods, but worked better for his way of learning. One afternoon, about a month into their lessons, Richard invited several of his colleagues to observe a practice session. Some of them had expressed doubt that a blind student could truly advance in classical piano. They weren't being cruel, just realistic about the traditional requirements of serious musical study. Richard wanted to show them what he had discovered. Marcus arrived with his mother as usual, completely unaware that he would have an audience. Richard had decided not to tell him about the observers, wanting the boy to play naturally without the pressure of performing. As Marcus began working through a Bach invention, the teachers who had come to watch exchanged glances of amazement. The boy's fingers moved with confidence and accuracy. When Richard made corrections, Marcus implemented them immediately, his muscle memory adapting without the need for visual confirmation. He asked intelligent questions about phrasing and interpretation that showed deep musical thinking. This wasn't just a child with a good ear. This was a serious student making rapid progress. After the session ended and Sarah and Marcus left, Richard's colleagues surrounded him with questions. How had he taught the boy to find keys so accurately? How did Marcus remember such complex fingering patterns? Richard explained his methods, but he was honest about the truth. Much of Marcus's progress came from his own determination and natural ability, not from any special teaching technique. One of the older teachers, a woman named Margaret, who had been skeptical from the beginning, asked the question everyone was thinking. She wanted to know if Richard truly believed Marcus could have a professional career. Could he perform in concerts? Could he compete with sighted pianists who had access to the full range of traditional training methods? Richard was silent for a moment, considering his answer carefully. Then he said something that surprised them all. He told them that Marcus didn't just have the potential to compete with other pianists. He believed the boy had the potential to become one of the greatest pianists of his generation. The way Marcus understood music, the emotional depth he brought to every piece, these weren't things that could be taught. They were gifts, and Marcus had them in abundance. Not everyone agreed with Richard's assessment. Some teachers thought he was being overly optimistic, letting his emotional attachment to Marcus cloud his professional judgment. They pointed out the practical obstacles. How would Marcus navigate large concert halls? How would he handle the pressure of performing without visual cues? How would he learn new pieces quickly enough to build a professional repertoire? But Richard had faith in his student. He had seen something in that first practice session that convinced him Marcus was special. And as the weeks turned into months, that conviction only grew stronger. Marcus was learning pieces in half the time it took other students. His performances had a maturity that belied his young age. And most importantly, he loved music with a passion that inspired everyone around him. 6 months into their work together, Richard made a decision. He told Sarah that he wanted to enter Marcus in a regional youth piano competition. It would be the boy's first public performance, a chance to play in front of judges and an audience. Sarah was nervous about exposing Marcus to potential criticism and rejection, but Richard assured her that the boy was ready. Marcus was excited about the competition. He had never performed for anyone except his mother and Richard. The idea of sharing his music with a larger audience thrilled him. For weeks he practiced his competition piece, a Mozart sonata that required both technical precision and expressive interpretation. The night before the competition, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay awake wondering if he had made the right decision. Was Marcus truly ready for this? What if the judges didn't appreciate his unique style? What if they focused on the unconventional aspects of his playing rather than recognizing his talent? Richard realized he was more nervous than his student. The morning of the competition arrived bright and clear. Sarah dressed Marcus in his best clothes, a white shirt and dark pants that made him look older than his 9 years. They arrived at the venue early, and Richard met them in the lobby. He could feel his heart pounding as they walked through the elegant concert hall. Other young pianists and their families filled the space, everyone preparing for their moment on stage. Some students practiced fingering patterns in the air. Others reviewed their sheet music one last time. Parents offered last-minute encouragement and advice. In the midst of this nervous energy, Marcus sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap, a small smile on his face. When his name was called, Marcus stood and took his mother's hand. She guided him to the stage stairs, and then Richard took over, walking the boy to the piano bench and making sure he was comfortable. The audience grew quiet as they realized the contestant was blind. Some whispered to their neighbors, wondering how this would work. Marcus placed his hands on the piano keys, feeling their familiar smoothness beneath his fingers. He took a deep breath and began to play. The opening notes of Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 16 filled the concert hall with crystalline clarity. His small hands moved across the keyboard with precision and grace, each note perfectly timed and weighted. In the audience, Sarah gripped the armrest of her seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. Beside her, Richard sat forward, his professional ear catching every nuance of Marcus's performance. The boy was playing even better than he had in practice. Perhaps it was the superior quality of the concert grand piano, or maybe it was the energy of performing for an audience, but something magical was happening on that stage. The judges sat at a table near the front, their faces impassive as they made notes on their scoring sheets. They were experienced musicians who had heard hundreds of young pianists over the years. They knew how to separate genuine talent from mere technical competence. As they listened to Marcus, their pens slowed, then stopped. One judge, a gray-haired woman who had been a professional pianist for 4 decades, leaned back in her chair with wide eyes. Marcus moved through the first movement of the sonata with confidence. Mozart's music requires a delicate balance between precision and expression, and the boy demonstrated mastery of both. His fingers danced through the rapid passages without hesitation, and when the music called for gentleness, His touch became feather-light. He wasn't just playing notes, he was telling a story, creating a conversation between different musical themes. Other contestants and their parents watched from the wings in the audience, initially curious about how a blind child would perform. As the piece continued, curiosity transformed into genuine admiration. A teenage girl who had just performed her own piece leaned toward her mother and whispered that Marcus was incredible. Her mother nodded, unable to take her eyes off the small figure at the piano. The second movement began, slower and more contemplative than the first. This section tests a pianist's ability to sustain melodic lines and create emotional depth. Marcus approached it with remarkable maturity. He understood that this wasn't just a technical exercise, it was a meditation, a moment of reflection within the larger work. His phrasing was natural and unforced, breathing with the music rather than imposing rigid structure upon it. Richard found himself blinking back tears. He had spent 30 years teaching piano, becoming increasingly cynical about musical education. Too many students played correctly but without soul, executing pieces mechanically while missing their essence. Marcus reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. The boy played with pure joy, with complete presence, with total commitment to the beauty he was creating. One of the judges, a stern-looking man who was known for harsh critiques, set down his pen entirely. He crossed his arms and simply listened, a slight smile appearing on his usually serious face. He had come to this competition expecting to hear competent performances from well-trained children. He had not expected to hear artistry of this caliber from anyone, let alone a 9-year-old. The final movement arrived, the tempo increasing as Mozart's playful spirit emerged in cascading scales and joyful melodic leaps. Marcus's fingers flew across the keys with dazzling speed. This was the most technically demanding section of the piece, and the boy navigated it flawlessly. His hands crossed over each other seamlessly. His rhythm remained steady even in the most complex passages, and his dynamics shaped the music with intelligent contrast. As Marcus approached the final phrases, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. The closing measures built to a satisfying conclusion, and when the last chord sounded, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then the audience erupted. People stood from their seats, applauding enthusiastically. Some shouted words of praise and encouragement. Marcus lifted his hands from the keys and turned his face toward the sound of the applause. His smile was radiant. He stood and took a small bow, just as Richard had taught him. Sarah was crying openly now, her hand pressed to her heart. Richard was on his feet, clapping harder than anyone else, pride shining in his eyes. The judges conferred briefly among themselves, their discussion more animated than usual. The gray-haired woman was emphatic about something, gesturing with her hands for emphasis. The stern man nodded in agreement. The third judge, a younger musician who taught at a prestigious conservatory, was smiling and shaking his head in apparent disbelief. After Marcus left the stage with Richard's guidance, several other young pianists performed their competition pieces. Some were quite good, demonstrating years of training and natural ability, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the hall. Everyone who had heard Marcus play knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The other performances, no matter how skilled, seemed to lack the same depth and emotional authenticity. During the intermission before the results were announced, other parents and teachers approached Sarah to ask about Marcus. They wanted to know his story, how he had learned to play, who had been teaching him. Sarah answered their questions graciously, explaining their journey to find a teacher and their good fortune in finding Richard. An elderly man who had been sitting near the front came over and introduced himself as a retired concert pianist. He told Sarah that in his 50 years of performing and teaching, he had rarely heard someone play with such natural musicality. He asked if he could meet Marcus personally. Sarah agreed, touched by his kindness. When the man spoke to Marcus, he didn't patronize the boy or focus on his blindness. Instead, he asked intelligent questions about how Marcus thought about musical phrasing and interpretation. Marcus answered thoughtfully, explaining that he imagined the music as colors and shapes and that different composers had different textures in his mind. The elderly pianist was fascinated, saying this synesthetic approach to music was something he had read about but never encountered directly. Finally, the time came for the judges to announce the competition results. The hall grew quiet as the head judge, the gray-haired woman, approached the microphone on stage. She began by complimenting all the young performers on their dedication and skill. Then she explained that while all the contestants had played admirably, the judges had reached a unanimous decision about the winner. She paused for dramatic effect, and Sarah reached for Marcus's hand. The boy seemed calm, but Sarah could feel his palm was slightly damp with nervous anticipation. Richard stood beside them, his expression carefully neutral. But inside he was praying that the judges had recognized what he knew to be true. The judge announced that the first-place winner of the youth piano competition was Marcus. The hall exploded with applause once again, even louder than before. Marcus's face showed pure joy mixed with disbelief. Sarah hugged her son tightly, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. Richard placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing gently, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. As Marcus made his way back to the stage to receive his trophy, the entire audience gave him a standing ovation. The other contestants and their families applauded as well, recognizing that the decision was not only fair but obvious. Marcus had played at a level beyond his years, beyond his limited training time, beyond what anyone had expected from a blind child at a regional youth competition. The gray-haired judge handed Marcus his trophy and spoke to him quietly. She told him that she had been judging piano competitions for 20 years, and his performance was one of the most moving she had ever heard. She encouraged him to continue his studies, saying the world needed to hear his gift. Marcus thanked her, his voice soft but sincere. After the ceremony, several music teachers and directors from prestigious programs approached Richard. They wanted to know more about Marcus, about his training, about his potential. One woman from a renowned music academy for young prodigies asked if Marcus might be interested in their program. Richard promised to discuss it with Marcus and his mother, but his protective instincts were already rising. He didn't want Marcus to be rushed or pressured into anything. On the drive home that evening, Marcus sat in the back seat holding his trophy, running his fingers over its surface to understand its shape. He was quiet, processing everything that had happened. Sarah glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her heart full of gratitude and hope. Her son had proven today that his dreams were possible, that his blindness didn't define his limits. News of Marcus's competition victory spread through the local music community and beyond. A journalist from the regional newspaper heard about the blind boy who had won the youth piano competition and requested an interview. Sarah was hesitant at first, worried about exposing Marcus to too much attention too soon, but Richard encouraged her to accept. He believed the world should know about Marcus's gift, and that his story might inspire other children facing challenges. The article appeared on the front page of the art section, complete with a photo of Marcus at the piano. The headline read, "9-year-old blind pianist stuns competition judges." The reporter had captured the essence of Marcus's achievement, describing his performance with genuine admiration while being respectful about his disability. She quoted the competition judges, who spoke enthusiastically about Marcus's natural musicality and emotional depth. The response to the article was overwhelming. Sarah's phone rang constantly with calls from people who wanted to support Marcus's musical education. A local piano store offered to loan them a quality acoustic piano for their home. A wealthy businessman who had read the article contacted them to offer a scholarship fund for Marcus's lessons. Music schools from across the state sent information about their programs, but with the positive attention came unexpected challenges. Some people questioned whether it was appropriate to celebrate Marcus's achievement so publicly. They worried that the focus on his blindness was patronizing, suggesting he was being praised not for his actual talent, but for overcoming disability. Others wondered if the pressure of public attention would harm his development as a musician. Richard discussed these concerns with Sarah during one of Marcus's lessons. They both agreed that while the attention was flattering, they needed to be careful. Marcus was still just a child, and his love of music needed to remain pure and joyful, not burdened by expectations or public pressure. They decided to decline most interview requests and focus on Marcus's continued education and growth. As Marcus continued his studies with Richard, his progress was remarkable. By age 10, he was playing pieces that challenged advanced teenage students. His repertoire expanded to include works by Beethoven, Rachmaninoff, Debussy, and contemporary composers. Each new piece seemed to unlock something different in his playing, revealing new dimensions of his musical personality. Richard adapted his teaching methods continuously, learning alongside his student. He discovered that Marcus had an almost supernatural ability to memorize music. After hearing a piece just a few times, Marcus could play it back with incredible accuracy. His fingers seemed to map the keyboard in his mind, creating a three-dimensional mental picture that was perhaps more vivid than visual memory. But Richard also worked hard to ensure Marcus developed proper technique. Natural talent could only take someone so far. True mastery required disciplined practice and attention to technical details. He taught Marcus exercises to strengthen his fingers, methods to prevent injury, and ways to build endurance for longer pieces. Marcus approached these technical studies with the same enthusiasm he brought to learning new compositions. When Marcus turned 11, Richard felt he was ready for another significant challenge. He wanted to enter Marcus in a national youth piano competition, one that attracted the most talented young pianists from across the country. This would be a much higher level of competition than the regional contest Marcus had won 2 years earlier. The judges would be renowned musicians and the other contestants would be exceptionally skilled. Sarah was nervous about the idea. The regional competition had been wonderful, but this national event carried much higher stakes. What if Marcus didn't win? What if he felt discouraged or lost confidence in his abilities? Richard understood her concerns but believed Marcus needed to test himself at this level. The boy's talent deserved to be recognized on a larger stage, and the experience would be valuable regardless of the outcome. They decided to let Marcus make the decision himself. When Richard explained the opportunity, Marcus's response was immediate and enthusiastic. He wanted to compete. The chance to play for new audiences and be judged alongside the country's best young pianists excited rather than intimidated him. His courage and confidence amazed both Richard and Sarah. Marcus chose to perform Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 8, known as the Pathétique. It was an ambitious selection, a piece that required not only technical mastery but deep emotional understanding. The dramatic opening demanded power and precision. The lyrical second movement needed delicate touch and sustained melodic lines. The final movement called for brilliant fingerwork and rhythmic drive. For months, Marcus worked on the sonata with intense focus. Richard pushed him harder than ever before, demanding perfection in every phrase, every dynamic change, every articulation. He wanted Marcus to be absolutely prepared, to walk onto that competition stage with complete confidence in his mastery of the piece. Marcus rose to the challenge, practicing for hours each day, refining every detail until the music became an extension of himself. The national competition was held in a major concert hall in New York City. Sarah and Marcus flew there together, neither of them having visited the city before. The scale and energy of New York was overwhelming for a boy who had spent his whole life in a small town. The sounds were intense, a constant cacophony of traffic, voices, and urban noise that made it difficult for Marcus to orient himself. Richard met them at their hotel, having arrived a day earlier. He took them to the concert hall for a practice session, wanting Marcus to become familiar with the space and the piano he would be playing. The hall was magnificent, with soaring ceilings and rows upon rows of red velvet seats. The concert grand piano on stage was one of the finest instruments in the country. When Marcus sat at that piano and played his first notes, everyone in the hall stopped what they were doing to listen. Stagehands setting up chairs, other contestants rehearsing in the wings, competition staff checking equipment, all paused to hear the sound. Even in an empty hall during a casual practice session, Marcus's playing commanded attention. The day of the competition arrived with gray skies and light rain. Inside the concert hall, nearly 20 young pianists would compete, each one exceptionally talented, each one representing years of intensive training and natural ability. Marcus was one of the youngest contestants, and the only blind performer. Backstage before his performance, Marcus sat quietly while other contestants paced nervously or practiced fingering patterns in the air. A girl about 14 years old approached him and introduced herself. Her name was Elena, and she told Marcus she had heard him practice the day before. She said his playing was beautiful and she was honored to be competing alongside him. Her kindness touched both Marcus and Sarah. When Marcus's name was called, he walked to the stage with Richard's guidance. The audience was much larger than at the regional competition. Hundreds of people filled the seats, including music critics, conservatory directors, professional pianists, and families of the contestants. Marcus could hear the rustling of programs, quiet conversations, the settling of an audience preparing to listen. He sat at the piano and took a moment to center himself. Richard had taught him to use these few seconds to clear his mind of everything except the music. Marcus placed his hands on the keys and began the dramatic opening chords of the Pathétique. The sound filled the hall with Beethoven's passion and power. From the very first measures, it was clear this would be an extraordinary performance. Marcus played with maturity far beyond his 11 years. The dramatic contrasts in the opening movement were perfectly executed, thundering chords giving way to delicate passages with seamless transitions. His technical command was flawless, but more impressive was his musical intelligence, the way he shaped phrases and built emotional intensity. The second movement, the famous Adagio cantabile, showed a different side of Marcus's artistry. This movement is one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever written, a meditation on loss and longing. Marcus played it with heartbreaking tenderness, each note sustained with perfect touch, the melody singing above the gentle accompaniment. Several people in the audience wiped tears from their eyes. In the judges section, 5 distinguished musicians listened with growing amazement. They had judged many competitions and heard countless talented young people. But Marcus was different. His playing had an authenticity and depth that couldn't be taught. One judge leaned toward another and whispered that they were witnessing something truly special. The final movement began, the tempo increasing as Beethoven's energy returned. Marcus's fingers raced through the difficult passages with brilliant clarity. This movement demands both speed and control, and Marcus demonstrated complete mastery. The music built to its exciting conclusion, and when Marcus played the final chords, the hall erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. The standing ovation for Marcus seemed to shake the very foundations of the concert hall. People rose from their seats as if pulled by invisible strings, their applause thunderous and sustained. In the wings, other contestants watched with expressions ranging from admiration to disbelief. Elena, the girl who had spoken to Marcus before his performance, was crying openly, moved by what she had just witnessed. Richard stood in the audience with tears streaming down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. This was the moment he had dreamed of since that first practice session, when he had so foolishly told Marcus he would never truly play piano. The boy had not only proven him wrong, he had exceeded every expectation, every hope. Richard felt profound gratitude that he had been given the chance to be part of Marcus's journey. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands, overwhelmed by emotion. She thought back to all the teachers who had turned them away, all the people who had said it was impossible, all the moments when she had doubted whether she was doing the right thing by encouraging Marcus's dreams. Now standing in this magnificent hall, listening to hundreds of people celebrate her son's gift, she knew every struggle had been worth it. Marcus took several bows, his face glowing with joy. He could feel the energy of the audience's appreciation washing over him like waves. This was why he loved music. This connection with other human beings, this ability to share something beautiful that transcended words and touched people's hearts directly. He had given everything he had to that performance, and the audience's response told him they had received his gift. After all the contestants had performed, there was a long intermission while the judges deliberated. The competition was close, with several truly exceptional performances. But when the judges gathered to compare their scoring sheets, they found themselves in quick agreement. Marcus had not just won the competition, he had redefined what they thought possible for a young pianist. The head judge, a renowned conductor and pianist named Michael Chen, insisted on delivering the results personally. When he took the stage to announce the winners, he first spoke about the extraordinary level of talent they had witnessed that day. Every contestant, he said, had demonstrated remarkable skill and dedication. But then he paused and said that occasionally, very rarely, judges encountered a performance that transcended competition, that became something closer to art. The hall grew silent as everyone sensed what was coming. Michael Chen announced that the first-place winner, by unanimous decision of all 5 judges, was Marcus. The audience erupted once more, the applause even louder than before. Marcus's fellow contestants joined in the celebration, recognizing that they had been present for something historic. As Marcus made his way to the stage to receive his award, Michael Chen did something unusual. Instead of simply handing over the trophy, he asked if he could speak to the audience about Marcus's performance. The hall quieted, and the conductor began to explain what made Marcus's playing so special. He talked about technique and musicality, about the technical mastery Marcus had displayed. But more importantly, he spoke about the emotional authenticity of the performance. Marcus, he said, played music the way it was meant to be played, with complete honesty and vulnerability. He didn't hide behind technique or try to impress with flashy displays. He simply opened his heart and shared the beauty he found in Beethoven's notes. Then Michael Chen said something that would change Marcus's life forever. He announced that he wanted to personally invite Marcus to perform as a guest soloist with his symphony orchestra in their upcoming season. The audience gasped at this announcement. Such invitations were rarely extended to adult professionals, let alone to 11-year-old competitors. It was an extraordinary honor and opportunity. Marcus stood on stage holding his trophy, trying to process what he had just heard. Perform with a real symphony orchestra? Play in front of thousands of people? It seemed like a dream, too wonderful to be real. But Michael Chen was shaking his hand, congratulating him, assuring him the invitation was genuine. Backstage after the ceremony, Marcus was surrounded by well-wishers. Music directors from prestigious conservatories wanted to discuss his future education. Journalists requested interviews. Other pianists wanted to meet him and congratulate him. Through it all, Richard stayed close, protecting Marcus from being overwhelmed while allowing him to enjoy his moment of triumph. One person who approached them was particularly interesting. She was a woman in her 60s named Dr. Patricia Morrison, director of a specialized music program for gifted young musicians. Her program was known for nurturing prodigies while protecting their childhoods, balancing intensive musical training with normal development. She had been so impressed by Marcus's performance that she wanted to offer him a full scholarship to her program. Dr. Morrison explained that her school was different from typical conservatories. They didn't just focus on creating performers, they developed complete musicians who understood music theory, composition, history, and multiple instruments. She believed Marcus's gifts deserved this kind of comprehensive education. Moreover, she had experience working with students who had disabilities, and she was confident they could provide the support Marcus needed. Sarah and Richard listened carefully to Dr. Morrison's presentation. The program sounded wonderful, but it would require a major life change. The school was located several states away, and while they offered housing for students, it would mean Marcus living away from home most of the year. Sarah's heart ached at the thought of being separated from her son, but she also recognized this could be an incredible opportunity for his development. They decided not to make any immediate decisions. Marcus was still processing his competition victory, and they didn't want to rush into anything. Dr. Morrison understood and gave them her contact information, encouraging them to visit the school and see the program firsthand before deciding. The invitation to perform with Michael Chen's symphony orchestra came with a date 6 months in the future. This gave Marcus time to prepare for what would be his first major professional performance. Michael Chen suggested they perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most beloved and challenging pieces in the piano repertoire. When Richard heard the selection, he had mixed feelings. The Rachmaninoff Second was a massive work, requiring tremendous technical skill, physical endurance, and mature musical interpretation. Professional pianists spent months preparing for performances of this concerto. Asking an 11-year-old to learn and perform it with orchestra seemed almost impossible, but Marcus was thrilled with the challenge. He had fallen in love with Rachmaninoff's music, the sweeping melodies and rich harmonies that created such emotional depth. The piece felt right to him somehow, as if it had been waiting for him to discover it. Richard saw the excitement in his student's face and decided to trust Marcus's instincts. The preparation for the orchestral performance consumed the next several months. Richard contacted Michael Chen to coordinate rehearsal schedules and discuss interpretation. Marcus practiced the concerto constantly, learning not just his own part, but also studying the orchestral score so he understood how all the parts fit together. Learning a piano concerto presented unique challenges for Marcus. Unlike solo pieces where he controlled everything, a concerto required coordination with dozens of other musicians. He would need to stay with the conductor's tempo, make room for orchestral solos, and time his entrances perfectly. Richard worked extensively on developing Marcus's ability to hear and respond to the orchestra around him. They used recordings to practice, playing orchestral tracks while Marcus performed the piano part. Richard helped Marcus understand the structure of the piece, explaining when the orchestra would be loud and when they would be soft, when they would play together and when Marcus would be alone. Marcus absorbed all of this information with his characteristic quick understanding. As the performance date approached, the concert began generating significant buzz in the classical music world. News that an 11-year-old blind pianist would be performing Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto with a major symphony orchestra attracted attention from music critics and journalists nationally. Some people were excited to witness what promised to be an extraordinary event. Others were skeptical, wondering if this was a publicity stunt that would compromise artistic standards. The skepticism bothered Richard more than it bothered Marcus. The boy had a remarkable ability to ignore negativity and focus on the music itself. He wasn't performing to prove anything to critics or doubters. He was performing because he loved music and wanted to share that love with anyone willing to listen. 1 week before the concert, Marcus and Sarah traveled to the city where the orchestra was based. They attended rehearsals, giving Marcus a chance to work with the full orchestra for the first time. When he walked onto the stage for that first rehearsal, surrounded by professional musicians holding their instruments, he felt a thrill of nervous excitement. Michael Chen welcomed Marcus warmly, introducing him to the orchestra members. Then they began to work. From the opening measures when the piano enters after the orchestral introduction, it was clear that something special was happening. The orchestra musicians were astonished by how naturally Marcus worked with them. Many had been skeptical about performing with such a young soloist, especially one who was blind, but Marcus's musicianship won them over immediately. He responded to Michael Chen's conducting cues through the subtle changes in the orchestra's sound, his ears so finely tuned that he could hear the conductor's intentions reflected in how the musicians played. During a break in rehearsal, several orchestra members approached Marcus to tell him how much they were enjoying working with him. The principal cellist, a woman who had played with countless soloists over her 30-year career, told Marcus that his interpretation of the slow movement was one of the most beautiful she had ever heard. Her words brought tears to Sarah's eyes as she watched from the hall seats. The concert was scheduled for a Saturday evening, and by midweek all tickets had sold out. People were driving from neighboring states to attend, curious to witness what had been described as a potentially historic musical event. The concert hall added extra seats and made arrangements to live stream the performance for those who couldn't attend in person. Richard arrived 2 days before the concert to support Marcus during the final preparations. He sat through rehearsals, offering occasional suggestions but mostly just watching with pride as his student worked with the orchestra. Marcus had grown so much in the 3 years since that first practice session. He was no longer just a talented child, he was becoming a true artist. The night before the concert, Marcus couldn't sleep. Not from nervousness, but from excitement. He lay in the hotel bed, mentally playing through the entire concerto, hearing the orchestra in his mind, feeling the keys beneath his fingers. This was the biggest moment of his life so far, and he wanted to be fully present for every second of it. Saturday arrived with perfect weather, as if the universe itself was cooperating with the special occasion. Throughout the day, Marcus remained calm and focused. He ate a light lunch, took a short walk with his mother, and rested in the afternoon. Richard stopped by to check on him, and they talked about anything except the upcoming performance, both of them knowing that Marcus was as prepared as he could possibly be. As evening approached, Marcus dressed in the formal concert attire that had been specially tailored for him. The black tuxedo made him look older than his 11 years, more like a professional performer than a child. Sarah helped him with his bow tie, her hands shaking slightly. She was more nervous than her son, worried about everything that could go wrong, unable to relax despite Marcus's calm demeanor. They arrived at the concert hall 2 hours before the performance. Marcus went to the green room while the orchestra members were warming up and preparing. Michael Chen stopped by to speak with Marcus one final time, not to give instructions or advice, but simply to tell the boy how honored he was to be conducting this performance. He said that regardless of what happened on stage, Marcus had already proven himself to be a remarkable musician. As the audience began filling the concert hall, there was an electric energy in the air. People took their seats with anticipation, reading through their programs, discussing Marcus's story with their neighbors. Music critics from major newspapers and magazines had traveled to attend, their notepads ready. The live stream had attracted thousands of online viewers from around the world. Backstage, Marcus could hear the orchestra tuning their instruments, the random sounds gradually organizing into harmonic order. He listened to the oboe giving the pitch to the other instruments, a ritual that had been repeated before countless concerts throughout history. He felt connected to that history, to all the musicians who had stood backstage before important performances, feeling the same mixture of excitement and nerves. Richard found Marcus sitting quietly, his hands folded in his lap, a peaceful expression on his face. Richard sat beside him and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. He told Marcus that he had watched him grow from a child who could barely reach the pedals to an artist ready to perform on one of the world's great stages. Whatever happened tonight, Richard said, he was proud of Marcus not just as a teacher but as a person who had learned so much from his student. The stage manager knocked on the door to signal it was time. Marcus stood, took a deep breath and smiled at Richard and his mother. He told them not to worry, that he was ready, that this was what he had been working toward for years. Then he walked toward the stage entrance, guided by the stage manager's gentle hand on his elbow. The house lights dimmed, and the audience grew silent. Michael Chen walked onto the stage first, acknowledging the audience's applause before taking his position at the conductor's podium. Then Marcus was announced and he walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. The audience rose to their feet even before he had played a single note, moved by the courage of this young blind boy who was about to attempt something so ambitious. Marcus felt the warmth of the applause wash over him as he made his way to the piano. He sat on the bench, adjusted its position slightly, and placed his hands on his knees, waiting for the audience to settle. The hall gradually quieted until it was silent enough to hear someone's nervous cough from the balcony. Michael Chen raised his baton, and the orchestra began. The opening of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto starts with the orchestra alone, building tension and establishing themes before the piano enters. Marcus sat perfectly still, listening intently, feeling the music build around him. He knew every note the orchestra was playing, having studied the score so carefully with Richard. Then came his moment. The piano's first entrance in this concerto is dramatic and important, setting the tone for everything that follows. Marcus's hands moved to the keys and he began to play. His opening chords were powerful and confident, perfectly timed with the orchestra. The balance between piano and orchestra was ideal, neither overpowering the other but working together to create something greater than either could achieve alone. As the first movement progressed, Marcus and the orchestra moved as one. The famous themes of the concerto soared through the hall, Rachmaninoff's passionate melodies touching every heart in the audience. Marcus played with technical mastery but also with deep emotional understanding. He had lived with this music for months, and now he was sharing everything he had discovered in it. The first movement concluded with brilliant flourishes from the piano, and the audience wanted to applaud but held back, knowing that in a multi-movement work, applause should wait until the end. Instead, there were audible gasps of appreciation and whispered words of amazement. The second movement began, and this is where Marcus truly showed his artistry. The slow movement of Rachmaninoff's Second is one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever written, a love song without words. Marcus played it with such tenderness and depth of feeling that people throughout the hall found tears running down their cheeks. This wasn't just a boy playing notes. This was a soul speaking directly to other souls through the universal language of music. Sarah sat in the front row, crying quietly as she listened to her son pour his heart into the music. She thought about all the challenges they had faced, all the doors that had been closed in their faces, all the people who had said it was impossible. And yet here was Marcus, not just succeeding but creating beauty that moved hundreds of people to tears. Richard sat beside Sarah, experiencing emotions he couldn't quite name. Pride certainly, but also gratitude and humility. He had been given the privilege of guiding this extraordinary talent, but he knew Marcus's gift came from somewhere beyond teaching. The boy had something innate, something precious that Richard had simply helped to nurture and protect. The third movement exploded with energy, the tempo increasing as Rachmaninoff's music built toward its triumphant conclusion. Marcus's fingers raced across the keys with dazzling speed and accuracy. The technical demands of this movement are enormous, requiring tremendous physical endurance and mental focus. Marcus had both, his preparation showing in every perfectly executed passage. The orchestra matched his energy, the musicians inspired by the young soloist's passionate performance. Michael Chen conducted with animated gestures, his face showing the joy he felt being part of this special moment. The music built and built, tension mounting as the concerto approached its final measures. Then came the ending, the last powerful chords that bring the concerto to its conclusion. Marcus and the orchestra struck them together with perfect precision, and as the final sound faded into silence, the hall erupted. The standing ovation was instantaneous and overwhelming, the audience on their feet applauding, cheering, some people shouting words of praise. Marcus stood and took a bow, and the applause grew even louder. Michael Chen walked over and shook his hand, then gestured for the orchestra to stand and acknowledge the audience as well. The musicians rose to their feet, but they were applauding too. Applauding Marcus, recognizing that they had just been part of something truly extraordinary. The ovation continued for nearly 10 minutes. Marcus took multiple bows, and each time he did, the audience's enthusiasm seemed to renew. Music critics who had come prepared to write measured, professional reviews found themselves on their feet, caught up in the emotion of the moment.